I came to visit my son, but I could never have imagined that he had erased all memories of me. Let's start from the beginning. You'd think after all the miles I've walked in this life, the hardest part would be behind me. But no, dear. Sometimes the longest journey is the one that begins in your heart, before you even put your feet on the ground. It was a Wednesday when I finally set out to see my son. The sky was heavy with clouds, that kind of gray that sits right on your chest. I'd spent the night before pacing the little kitchen in my rental house, hands fluttering over the kettle, checking my bag for the fourth or fifth time. Not that I had much to bring, just a change of clothes, my sturdy walking shoes, and a battered photograph of my boy at 5 years old, toothy grin, hair sticking up like a rooster. I packed a jar of homemade peach preserves too. Silly maybe, but he always loved it on toast when he was small, and a mother's hands never forget the things her child liked, even when the child seems to have forgotten her. I counted out the bus fare twice, then once more for good measure. When you've lived most of your life with more month than money, you get in the habit of double-checking things. My hand shook a little as I zipped my coat and folded my best dress into the bottom of my suitcase, the blue one with the tiny daisies on the collar. I'd saved it for special days. I decided no matter what, today was special. The streets were slick with last night's rain as I walked to the bus stop. I passed the bakery where the window always fogged up and the post office with its peeling flag. The town was waking up around me, people heading to work, a school bus clattering by. It felt strange to be a traveler again at my age, to have somewhere to go, someone waiting on the other side, or so I hoped. The bus was late as usual. I waited on the cold metal bench, hugging my coat close, feeling the ache in my knees and the flutter in my chest. I must have looked like a misplaced parcel with my bag on my lap and my hat pulled low. I watched the cars go by, wondered about the lives inside them. How many mothers, how many children, how many stories all tangled up together. When the bus finally came, I climbed aboard, nodding to the driver out of old habit. The ride was long, rattling over cracked roads, past empty fields and shining strip malls. All the while my mind wandered back through the years. To the one-bedroom apartment where I used to rock my boy to sleep, humming old lullabies. To the winters when we'd both wear our socks to bed because the heat never quite reached the corners. To the spring mornings when we'd hunt for dandelions, and he'd stuff his pockets full of yellow. I pressed my face to the cold window, watched the world blur by. I wondered, not for the first time, what he'd be like now, my son. I'd seen the pictures, sure, magazines, a news story once or twice, always looking so polished, so certain. He'd made it, that's what everyone said. He'd climbed the ladder right out of the life we'd known, rung by rung, while I held steady at the bottom. Still, I held tight to my hope. Hope is a stubborn thing, dear. It grows in the cracks, even when you try not to water it. I wondered if he'd recognize me, if his arms would open, or if I'd see a flicker of the boy I once knew beneath all that success. Changing buses downtown, I nearly lost my nerve. My hands were sweating despite the chill, and I had to sit a moment just to catch my breath. I kept thinking of all the things I wanted to say, all the years between us, the words that had gone unsaid. But a mother doesn't give up. Not on her child, not even after the world tells her she should. When the last bus finally rolled into his neighborhood, I stood at the corner, looking up at houses bigger than anything I'd ever lived in. My feet felt heavier with each step down the sidewalk. I passed iron gates, trimmed hedges, a world away from the patch of grass behind my old duplex. I paused at the bottom of his driveway, staring up at a house that looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine. I straightened my skirt, pressed my lips together, and whispered a little prayer. Just a quiet mother's wish that this visit might bring something back, even if it was just a smile or a moment of warmth. I walked up that long, smooth driveway, my suitcase rolling behind me, the jar of preserves clinking in my bag. With each step, the past walked with me. The hunger, the laughter, the goodnight kisses, and all the love I had poured into that boy. No matter how much the world had changed, no matter how much he had changed, I was still his mother. And I had come home to him. I don't know what I expected, truly. Maybe a porch light left on, the scent of supper drifting out, something warm and familiar in a place so big and strange. But the truth, as it so often is, was much colder. The house looked more like a hotel than a home. White stone, tall glass, hedges trimmed so neat they could have been measured with a ruler. I pressed the little brass button beside the door and waited, listening to my own heart thudding against my ribs. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you ought to whisper even outside. After a long minute, the door opened just a crack. A young woman in a smart black uniform looked me over, her face polite and blank as a page. "May I help you?" she asked. She didn't smile. She didn't even blink. I cleared my throat and tried to stand a little taller. "Yes, dear. I'm here to see my son." I said his name, tried to soften it with a smile, but the name seemed to hang in the air without meaning. For a second, she just stared at me like I'd spoken in a language she didn't know. "Is he expecting you?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. I hesitated, and that was all it took. She stepped aside just enough to let me in, but not enough to make me feel welcome. I wheeled my little suitcase over the threshold and into a foyer bigger than my whole living room back home. The floors shone so bright I could see the scuffs on my shoes reflected back at me. "Please wait here," she said, and then disappeared down a long hallway, her footsteps swallowed by thick carpet. I stood there, the bag of preserves getting heavier in my hand. The air was chilly, scented faintly with flowers I couldn't name, and not a single thing in that house looked lived in. There were tall vases, heavy curtains, and a grand staircase that swept upward like something in a picture book. I waited, heart in my throat, listening to the faint sounds of voices and laughter drifting from somewhere far inside. I wondered if my son knew I was here yet, if he'd rush out to greet me with the old warmth in his eyes. But all I heard was the soft tick of a clock somewhere above me, measuring out the moments of my waiting. After a time, another woman appeared, older than the first but just as distant. She gave me a quick, practiced smile, one of those smiles you learn working behind a counter, meant for strangers. "You're here to see?" She repeated my son's name and I nodded, suddenly feeling small. "I'm his mother," I said quietly. She nodded, as if that explained everything and nothing at all. "Please wait in the sitting room." She led me down a hallway, past closed doors, past paintings in gold frames and mirrors so large I caught my own reflection. Gray hair, wrinkled coat, cheeks a little pink from the walk. I looked like someone who'd taken a wrong turn and wandered in off the street. The sitting room was beautiful but cold. White sofas, glass tables, not a pillow out of place. I sat on the edge of a cushion, afraid to leave a mark. My bag rested at my feet, the jar of preserves glinting in the soft light. I folded my hands and waited. Every sound echoed in the silence. The ticking clock, the faint hum of distant conversation, the soft shuffle of feet on the carpet outside the door. After several minutes, the door opened again. For a heartbeat, I thought it might be him. But no, it was a man I didn't know, crisp in a dark suit, carrying a clipboard. "Name?" he asked without looking up. I told him. He jotted something down, then nodded to himself and left as quickly as he came. It struck me then with a sudden ache how invisible I'd become. All my life I'd been someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's neighbor. Now I was just another name on a clipboard. Another wrinkle in a world that had no place for wrinkles at all. I sat and waited, looking out the window at a yard too perfect to be real. No toys left out, no dog barking, not a weed in sight. Just manicured grass and bright flowers. Beauty but not a living soul. I took a shaky breath, holding back the sting in my eyes. I'd come all this way hoping to find my boy, to bring him a little piece of home. But sitting there in that chilly, perfect room, I realized I was farther from him than ever. I waited for what felt like an eternity, listening for footsteps that never came. All the warmth I remembered from his childhood, the sticky hugs, the sleepy goodnights, the laughter over burnt toast, seemed to have been scrubbed away, just like the fingerprints on those glass tables. And so I sat there, a ghost from another life, clutching a jar of peach preserves and wishing, just for a moment, that someone in that house would look at me and see his mother. There's a certain kind of stillness in a strange house, when you realize you're not quite welcome, and the air itself seems to hold its breath around you. That's how it was sitting there in that grand chilly room. I'd begun to wonder if he'd ever come in at all. My fingers tapped the lid of the preserves jar in my lap, my heart thudding a worried rhythm. After what felt like ages, I heard voices approaching. Not the joyful shout of a son seeing his mother after so long, but the low, quick tones of business. I heard my boy's voice. Deeper than I remembered, sharper around the edges but still his. It made me ache all the same. He was speaking to someone or maybe a group, his words just a murmur through the heavy doors. I tried to straighten my dress and wipe the worry off my face, the way a mother does. I wanted to look proud, not pitiful, if he did come through that door. But before I could gather myself, the voices grew louder, so close I could make out every word. My boy was talking, but it wasn't to me. And after my mother died, everything changed. I was raised with nothing. It was a hard life, poverty, neglect, the kind of struggle you don't recover from easily. His voice was strong, practiced, almost theatrical. I felt a jolt go through me like stepping into cold water. I sat frozen, unsure if I'd heard right. I listened, breath held. He went on. It made me who I am, I suppose. Sometimes tragedy pushes you to succeed, gives you a reason to fight. But she's been gone a long time now. That's why my story is so powerful, so inspiring to people. I survived. I nearly dropped the preserves. Gone. My heart pounded in my ears. I pressed my hand to my chest and leaned forward, straining to hear. A woman's voice chimed in, soft and coaxing. Maybe a reporter, maybe someone with a tape recorder. It must have been so hard, growing up without a mother's love. He gave a little laugh, gentle, almost sad. You get used to it, he said. You have to. She passed away when I was very young, and my life since then, it's been a testament to resilience. That's the truth I tell. The room spun around me. For a moment I was back in that old apartment, scraping together enough for dinner, feeling my boy's arms around my neck. How could he say I was dead? How could he tell the world I was gone, erased like a chalk mark in the rain? The conversation continued on the other side of the wall, full of carefully chosen words. A story polished and repeated so often that even I almost believed it. He spoke of rising above, of loss, of a mother who existed only as a sad memory, a convenient ghost for his success. My eyes filled with tears, hot and silent. I wanted to stand, to rush into that hallway, to call out, I'm here. I never left you. I gave you everything I had, every last ounce, and now you're telling the world I'm just a shadow? But I couldn't move. The weight of those words pinned me to the sofa. I thought of every scraped knee I'd bandaged, every midnight I'd stayed awake while he coughed with fever, every single night I'd gone hungry so he could eat. To him I was gone. A chapter closed, a story rewritten. A heavy hush fell. I heard laughter, smooth, practiced, the kind people give to an audience. Someone clinked a glass, and I pictured them toasting to his strength, his survival, his story of loss. A story where I no longer existed. I sat there until the tears dried on my cheeks, my hands twisting the old handkerchief in my pocket. I realized then that my boy wasn't just lost to me. He had let me die in the eyes of the world, and in doing so had buried every memory, every scrap of love we had left. And still I waited, silent and small, in that perfect room, the truth sitting sharp and cold in my chest. Sometimes, sweetheart, the worst kind of betrayal isn't a knife or a cruel word. It's being written out of the story by the one you love most. They say that when your heart is truly broken, time folds in on itself. That's how it was for me, sitting in that cold, perfect room. Forgotten, dismissed, My whole life with my son reduced to a sad little footnote in the story he told to strangers. As the hush of the house pressed in around me, my mind slipped away from the present, carrying me back into the little corners of the past, where our real life, his and mine, was scribbled into the margins. I saw us in that first cramped apartment, him barely out of diapers, me barely out of my teens, a single mother with nothing but hope and a stubborn love. The winters were long and sharp in those days. I'd stuff old towels under the door to keep the wind from whistling through the floorboards. Our heater rattled like a tin can, but I'd set a kettle to boil on the stove, steam curling in the cold air, and he'd curl beside me under every blanket we owned. We didn't have much, but what we had we made do. I'd make soup out of a bone and a handful of rice, stretching it as far as I could. I remember him sitting at the table, legs dangling, big eyes watching me while I scraped every last bit out of the pot. He'd clap when I handed him his bowl. "You make the best soup, Mama," he'd say, and I'd ruffle his hair, swallowing my own hunger with a smile. Summers were different, soft, green, and noisy with laughter. We'd walk down to the park with a sack lunch, peanut butter sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, apple slices turning brown in the sun. Sometimes I'd find enough spare change to buy us one soda to share, 2 straws tucked in the glass. He'd always let me have the last sip. Those were the days when love felt simple, a sun-warmed cheek sticky with jam, a giggle as he chased pigeons, shoes scuffed and knees bruised. Birthdays were homemade, every one. I'd make him a little cake from scratch, just flour, eggs, and whatever fruit I could afford. I'd light a single candle and we'd sing together, off-key and happy, just the two of us in our little kitchen. He'd blow out the candle and squeeze my hand so tight. "Make a wish, Mama," he'd say. And every year my wish was always the same, that he'd be safe, that he'd feel loved, that the world would never take his sweetness from him. School mornings were a scramble. Shoes missing, mittens forgotten, hair sticking up in every direction. But I always packed his lunch and pressed a kiss to his forehead before he ran out the door. When he came home breathless and full of stories, I'd listen to every word, even the wild ones about pirates and astronauts and monsters under the bed. We'd build forts out of couch cushions, read library books by flashlight, and fall asleep in a heap of laughter and dreams. I worked long hours waitressing, cleaning houses, doing laundry for folks who barely remembered my name. My hands grew rough, my back ached, but I never complained. Not to him. At night, after he fell asleep, I'd sit by the window and sew up holes in his pants, patch elbows, count out the pennies in a jar for next week's groceries. I promised myself that whatever happened, he'd never know how hard it was for me. He'd just know he was loved. Sometimes there were storms. Nights when the power went out and we'd huddle together in the dark, telling each other silly stories to keep the fear away. I remember the night lightning struck the old tree outside our window. He was shaking so hard, I wrapped my arms around him and hummed the old lullaby my mother used to sing to me. "You're safe, sweetheart," I whispered, "as long as I'm here." Now, sitting in that mansion, I realized those days had become nothing but shadows, swept aside to make room for a new story, one where I'd been erased entirely. But I remembered everything. The scraped knees and birthday wishes, the smell of soup on the stove, the quiet ache of loving a child with your whole battered heart. Those memories are all I had left in that house. Small, ordinary moments the world would never see, tucked away in the margins where no reporter's camera or audience applause could reach. And even as I sat there, invisible, I held tight to those memories. Because if I let them go, I'd lose myself entirely. So I closed my eyes just for a moment and let the memories hold me. I was more than a ghost. I was a mother who loved her boy with every inch of her soul, no matter what story the world tried to write in my place. After a time when my eyes were dry and my mind had wandered through all those years, I heard the sound of footsteps in the hall, heels clicking, laughter trailing behind. I straightened my skirt and tucked away the little handkerchief I'd been twisting in my lap. Hope is a stubborn thing. Even after all that, I still thought maybe, just maybe, he'd come through that door with open arms. But it wasn't my son who entered. It was a woman I didn't recognize, elegant as a painting, white hair styled perfectly, a soft shawl draped around her shoulders, eyes that glittered with a kind of practiced warmth. I watched her glide through the doorway, holding my son's arm, and the sight of them together hit me right in the ribs. There were people behind them, reporters, camera crews, folks holding notepads and microphones. All of them focused on the pair in the center of the room. My son and this woman, this stranger with a gentle smile and pearl earrings, the sort you'd expect to see reading to children at the library. My son's voice rang out, clear and confident. "This is my mother." He squeezed the woman's hand, pulling her close for the cameras. "She lost everything to raise me. I wouldn't be here without her strength." The crowd leaned in, some dabbing their eyes. I sat there, frozen, watching as the woman beamed and wiped a tear from her cheek. Her performance so perfect, I could almost believe it myself. She spoke softly, her voice trembling just so. "I always believed in him, even when no one else did. He was a good boy, he just needed a chance." She looked up at my son and he smiled back, eyes shining for the world to see. It was a lovely story, carefully rehearsed and beautifully delivered. I felt the world tilt beneath me. I was still, invisible on that sofa, clutching the jar of preserves I'd brought as an offering to the boy I'd raised. I wanted to stand up, to shout, "No, I am his mother. I was there for every fever, every scraped knee, every hungry night." But the words died in my throat. Who would have believed me, anyway? To them, I was just another guest, another piece of the scenery. For a moment, the actress turned her head. Her eyes met mine. There was a flicker of something there, a question, maybe even pity. Then she turned away, back to the crowd, and my son kept his arm wrapped tight around her shoulders, basking in their shared story. The cameras flashed. The crowd murmured, moved by the tale of a boy who'd risen from nothing, carried by the love of a mother who, in truth, was nowhere in that house but me. I watched the whole scene, a silent witness to my own erasure. My son had not only buried me, he had replaced me, a softer, sweeter version, all the sharp edges filed away for public comfort. He had traded the woman who raised him through fire for a stranger's gentle hands and camera-ready grace. I remembered all the nights I sat at the kitchen table, sewing patches on his jeans by the glow of a single lamp. I remembered how he'd curl against me in the dark, his breath warm on my shoulder, promising he'd always take care of me when he grew up. All of that, every sacrifice, every ache, every quiet victory, had been handed over to someone who wore motherhood like a borrowed shawl. When the cameras turned away, I slipped quietly from the room, my shoes whispering across the marble floor. I found a shadowed corner by the big window and watched the scene play out from a distance. My son's story was a grand one, the kind people wanted to believe. He needed a perfect mother. Gentle, smiling, conveniently dead. The real mother, flesh and blood, was too complicated for his world of bright lights and easy applause. And so I stood there, watching a stranger receive the love and honor I'd earned one hard year at a time. The double life was out in the open now. My son's story and my truth side by side but never touching. He had found it easier to invent a new past than to face the one that made him who he was. But I knew the truth, and standing in that cold, shining house, I promised myself one thing. I would not let myself become invisible, not even if the world refused to see me. I was his mother. No matter what anyone else believed, nothing could change that. If you've ever found yourself written out of your own story, you'll know that the world is quick to accept a good tale, especially if it's neat and tragic. By the time I left that room, quiet as a mouse, my shoes clicking softly down the hall, the story my son had woven was already growing roots outside those walls. I made my way out to the street, blinking in the sudden sunlight, my bag heavier than ever. I lingered by the stone gate, just long enough to catch my breath. I could hear the laughter, the flash of cameras behind me. I wondered if any of those people ever looked past the script. If anyone there would have believed that the real mother had stood right outside, unseen and uninvited. That evening, back at the small hotel I'd found, a room with a lamp that buzzed and sheets starched stiff, I turned on the television, hoping for something mindless to quiet my thoughts. But there was my son, his face shining in the studio lights, telling the same story again. My death was painted as the crucible that forged him, the loss that pushed him to greatness. The anchors spoke in soft, sad voices. He lost his mother so young. How remarkable, his rise from such poverty. A photo flashed on screen. Not of me, but of that woman, the one with the soft shawl and trembling hands, smiling in grainy black and white. I watched numb as the world mourned me. Neighbors, old friends, strangers all shared memories. Most of them not even true, but it hardly mattered. The story had grown beyond me. My phone, old stubborn thing, buzzed on the little table. Messages from a cousin, from a neighbor back home. I never knew you died so young. What a beautiful tribute your son gave. You must be so proud of him. One even sent condolences. I stared at the screen, unable to answer. And there it was, my own erasure spreading like ripples in a pond. People I'd baked casseroles for, watched their kids when they were sick, now believed I was long gone. I suppose it shouldn't have surprised me, but it stung just the same. The papers ran with the story too. A son's triumph over tragedy. There were articles about my sacrifice, my legacy. But none of it felt like me. It was a beautiful myth, polished and sold. And the world bought it up by the handful. The next morning I took a walk through the old part of town. The bakery girl who used to call me Mrs. looked right through me as if I were a stranger. Even the little dog next door, who always barked when I passed, didn't stir. I was there in the flesh, but to the world I was a memory, one that had been put to rest, neat and tidy. It's a strange feeling, darling, to be grieved while you're still alive. I wanted to shout, I'm here. I'm not gone. But grief, once let loose, is hard to call back. The world had chosen its version of my life, and it didn't include me anymore. I sat on a park bench as the sun came up, hands folded in my lap, and realized that even when your truth is quiet, it's still yours. No headline, no camera, no speech can change the love and work that filled the margins of my life. But oh, how it hurt to see it erased. So I sat in the hush of that early morning, letting the world have its story for now. My heart was bruised, but it wasn't broken, not completely. I still had the truth, and I still had the quiet strength of every hard-won day. And sometimes, darling, that's all you need to begin again. You'd think, after all I'd been through, the cold welcome, the lies spun for strangers, the sight of my own child clasping some stranger's hand and calling her mother, that a woman would reach for anger. You'd think I'd storm back up those marble steps, slam my fists on the door, and holler the truth until my voice gave out. But darling, life has softened some edges and sharpened others, and shouting was never my way. Not really. That night, back in my little hotel room, the kind of place with scratchy blankets and a chipped mug for tea, I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the hum of traffic outside. The city went on as if nothing had happened, as if a whole life hadn't just been quietly buried behind those iron gates. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that once braided my boy's hair when he let it grow out, the hands that worked till they cracked and bled. I ran my thumb along an old scar by my knuckle, a memory from slicing apples for his lunchbox. Funny, isn't it? How the body remembers what the world forgets. I let myself feel the weight of it all. Sometimes you have to. Cried just a little. I didn't sob or wail. It was more like a leak in an old roof, slow and steady. Just a few tears, hot and private, for the child I'd lost long before he put a stranger in my place. For the mother I'd been, quietly erased in the margins of his story. There are moments in life when you stand at a crossroads and realize no one is coming to save you. You have to decide who you want to be, not for the world but for yourself. I could have let bitterness bloom in my chest. I could have written angry letters, made phone calls to the newspapers, tried to claw back the piece of myself my son had taken. But my mother used to say, bitterness is like drinking poison and hoping the other person gets sick. I poured myself a cup of that thin hotel tea and promised I wouldn't do it, not to myself, and not to the memory of the woman I once was. Instead, I thought of all the women who came before me, women who survived heartbreak and humiliation without an audience or a headline. My own mother, raising 5 children on her own after my father died in a rail yard accident, never raised her voice above what was necessary. She taught me to weather storms with quiet dignity. You don't have to win every battle to keep your soul, honey, she'd whisper to me late at night, as we sat sewing patches on my brother's shirts. Sitting there in that small room, I realized I didn't want to win anything. I didn't want revenge or even an apology. What I wanted was to set things right, to reclaim the story that belonged to me, not with noise or spectacle, but with the steady hand of truth. I knew who I was. I knew what I had done, every meal cooked, every fever nursed, every time I put him first and myself second. If the world didn't see it, that was its blindness, not mine. As the night wore on, I found myself thinking of all the quiet ways women hold the world together. A hand on a fevered brow, a wordless hug after a long day. The way we remember the small details of other people's lives even when ours are unraveling. We make do. We keep going. We stitch the tears and smooth the rough edges. I was tired, bone-deep tired, but beneath it was something firmer, something that had survived years of hard living and harder loving. I still had my resolve. So I made a choice right then. I would not go to the news. I would not argue with strangers. I would not let my pain become a spectacle for the curious or the cruel. Instead, I would set the record straight quietly, steadily as best I could. Not for applause and certainly not for vengeance, but for peace. The kind that lets you sleep at night, knowing you never let the world turn you bitter or small. I brewed myself another cup of tea and sat with my memories, letting them comfort me like an old quilt. Every time I thought of the lies told about me, I countered them with the truth. The scar on my knuckle, the lullabies hummed in the dark, the birthday cakes baked from scratch. I was still here. I was still real. As dawn crept through the curtains, painting the walls with watery gold, I felt lighter. Not happy, not yet, but stronger. I watched the city waking up, the world moving on, and I promised myself I would move with it. I would gather what I needed, letters, photos, small tokens of our real life together. Not to hurt my son, but to lay my truth gently before the world, and before my own heart. Sometimes, sweetheart, the strongest thing you can do is not to fight at all, but to simply endure. To keep loving, to keep telling the truth, even if you're the only one listening. And so I did. Quietly, with all the courage I could muster, I set out to reclaim the story that belonged to me. Not for fame, not for revenge, just for peace, and for the gentle dignity that lives in every mother's heart. After that long sleepless night, I woke to the pale blue light of morning with a steadiness I hadn't felt in a long time. My hands still trembled as I made a little breakfast, just a piece of bread with jam and a weak cup of coffee, but my mind was set. I would set things right, not with noise or anger, but with gentle, honest proof. Not for glory and not to embarrass my son, but simply so the world, and perhaps even he himself, might know the life that really was. First, I made a list on the back of an envelope I'd found in my purse. It felt almost silly the way I wrote it out. Photographs, letters, birth certificate, neighbors' testimonies, old recipes, little scraps of a life shared, pieces that together made a truth too real to deny. I started with photographs. In the bottom of my suitcase, folded in a dish towel for safekeeping, I had the faded snapshots I'd carried everywhere. My boy at 5 years old, missing teeth and grinning in front of our old apartment door. Another, the two of us at his high school graduation, my hair already gray, his hand on my shoulder. A third, small and creased, of him as a newborn, wrapped in a blue blanket I'd knit myself during the longest, loneliest winter of my life. I laid them out on the little hotel desk, smoothing the corners, remembering every moment the camera had captured. In one photo, his face was smudged with chocolate frosting from a birthday cake I'd made with pennies scraped from my tip jar. In another, he wore a hand-me-down suit 2 sizes too big. But he beamed with pride all the same. The world might not know those details, but I did. And there was no actress or stranger alive who could claim the truth written in those pictures. Next, I turned to letters. I kept every note he ever wrote me, crayon scribbles from childhood, Mother's Day cards with shaky handwriting, a postcard from his first college trip. I even had the letters I'd written to him, unsent, during those long years when we drifted apart. "I'm proud of you always," I'd written, even when the distance was sharpest. "You'll always be my boy." My eyes blurred as I read them over, but I didn't let myself cry. Not this time. Tears would come later, after the work was done. I called my old neighbor Mrs. Bingham, using the cracked cell phone I'd brought from home. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Why, if it isn't you? What's going on, darling?" I hesitated, afraid to sound foolish, but she listened as I told her what happened. "He's saying I'm dead, Mrs. Bingham. He's replaced me." There was a pause, then her voice steady as ever. "Well, we both know that's not true. And I've got plenty of stories to tell anyone who'll listen about the years you and that boy lived upstairs from me." She promised to write down everything she remembered. How I'd borrowed eggs for baking, how my son mowed her lawn for $1, how she'd watched him grow up with her own eyes. "He was never alone, and he sure as sugar had a mother," she said. "I'll swear to it anywhere, anytime." Later that day, I walked to the courthouse and requested a copy of his birth certificate. The clerk, a tired-looking woman with a gentle smile, asked, "Relationship to the child?" I straightened my back, held my chin up and said, "I'm his mother." She nodded, took my ID and handed me the form. I left the building with proof in my purse, my name printed clear and unchangeable beside his. Back at the hotel, I gathered the old recipes too. All those little index cards in my own handwriting. Greasy from years of use banana bread, my mother's meatloaf, the apple pie I baked every Thanksgiving. His favorites, each one tied to a memory no outsider could ever fake. By the time the sun slipped down behind the city buildings, I had a small pile of evidence. A life's worth, really. It didn't look like much. Just some paper, a handful of photographs, and a few phone calls. But together they were enough. They were proof not just of my love but of my existence. Proof that no matter what story the world chose to believe, the truth was real and it was mine. As I sat on the narrow hotel bed, the light growing softer, I felt a gentle peace come over me. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't sought revenge. I'd simply gathered what was true and whole. Tomorrow I would find a way to let the world know quietly with dignity the way a mother must. Because in the end, darling, the truth is patient. And so am I. The next morning, I sat at that little desk by the hotel window, watching the sun slip through the slats and paint golden stripes across my pile of proof. I took a slow breath, smoothing the stack of letters and photos, the recipes written in my crooked handwriting, the copy of his birth certificate with my name right there for anyone to see. I felt nervous, but it wasn't fear that made my hands tremble. It was the simple, weighty relief of finally putting the truth into the world. No fuss, no fireworks, just honesty. I started with a letter. Not an angry one, not full of accusation, but just the truth, plain and loving. I wrote it to the local paper and the TV station that had run the story about my son and his late mother. I told them my name and I told them a little about my life. The years I worked 2 jobs, the long nights tending to a sick child, the joy and ache that fill a mother's days when she has nothing to give but herself. I included copies of what I'd gathered, photos, a page of my son's handwriting from when he was 8, the card he'd made me on my birthday that read, "Best mom in the world." I sent along the recipes too for good measure. Let them see the banana bread, the soup stains, the truth living quietly in the margins. My words were gentle. I told them I wasn't seeking attention, not after all these years of living small and quiet. I wrote, "I don't wish to shame my son, nor do I want a place in the spotlight. All I hope is that the story of our lives might be told true, not for the sake of pride or pity, but so that no one else's truth is swept away for the sake of a simpler headline." Then I mailed the envelope, watched the postman carry it away with all the other troubles and joys the world sends through the mail every day. I sent the same letter to a few old friends who'd written me, wondering if it could possibly be true that I was gone. "I'm still here," I wrote in my neatest script, "and I remember you." I didn't call a press conference. I didn't knock on my son's door or demand anything from anyone. I just set the truth free, gentle as a sparrow, trusting it would find its way. A week went by. The hotel clerk smiled kindly at me every morning as I left for my walk, never asking what I was doing or why I stayed so long. I took to visiting the little diner on the corner, drinking weak coffee and watching people hurry by, living their lives. Mothers dragging sleepy children, old men with newspapers, girls in pink jackets laughing in the cold. Life with all its heartache and sweetness just going on. Then quietly things began to shift. A letter arrived at the hotel care of my name. It was from the editor of the local paper. "We received your packet," he wrote, "and after reviewing your materials, we'd like to print a follow-up to our story." He said he was sorry for the pain I'd been caused. He called my letter dignified and moving. That made me smile in a sad sort of way. Dignity, after all, is just doing the right thing even when no one is watching. Soon there were other calls. A producer from the television station wanted to meet, but I declined. "I have nothing more to say than what I wrote," I told her. "I only wanted the truth in the open, not my name in lights." And then of course there was my son. He didn't call. I wasn't sure if he even knew. Maybe he'd read the paper, maybe someone told him. Maybe he just guessed when he saw his story begin to crumble at the edges. I worried for him, but I also hoped that maybe finally, he'd remember the woman who loved him quietly all those years, the one who'd never wanted anything but his happiness. For the first time in a long while I felt peace in my chest, as if a weight had been lifted. Not joy exactly, but a quiet satisfaction. I had set the record straight. I had not shouted, I had not demanded, I had simply told the truth. There's a kind of strength in that, darling, a softness that survives storms. I packed my things to leave the hotel. As I zipped my suitcase, I glanced at that old photo. My boy in his blue sweater, me beside him, tired but happy, our eyes bright with a love that needed no audience. I tucked it away, knowing the truth of it would outlast any story the world might choose to tell. And I stepped out into the sunlight, my head held high, knowing that whatever came next, I'd done what was right. The truth was free now, and so was I. It's a strange thing, sweetheart, watching a story unravel after it's been woven so tight. Once my letter found its way into the newspaper, just a small headline, "A Mother's Quiet Truth," the world began to shift. My words were simple, the truth laid bare, and for the first time the public saw the face behind the fairy tale. The photo they printed was plain and real. Me and my boy, long before he had a mansion or an audience. People read it, and the story began to ripple outward. The television station aired a quiet correction. Not with drama or blame, just honesty. Questions started coming, not to me but to my son. Investors and partners who had believed his story of loss and hardship began to pull away, uncertain and wary now that the myth had cracks. His business, built on the foundation of his tragic upbringing, began to stumble. The support he'd gathered on the back of that falsehood slipped away. Even the woman who played the role of his public mother was gone from his side. Her gentle smile no longer needed. I watched it all from my own small corner, never with joy or vengeance in my heart. My neighbors who had heard I was gone started to nod and smile again, some apologizing for believing the lie. I took comfort in the quiet return to my simple life, morning walks, my own tea, and the dignity of having spoken my truth. And as for my son, the shine faded from his eyes in every public appearance. I saw in his face not anger, but the weight of a story too heavy to carry any longer. His empire of sympathy and spectacle, built on my absence, was crumbling. But I didn't wish him harm. I just wished for peace for both of us in whatever ways it might come. Because the truth, once it finds the daylight, never really disappears. It stays quietly, just like a mother's love, holding steady even as the world spins on. It wasn't long before folks started knocking. Not on my front door, but on every door of my life they could find. It started with letters from strangers, calls from reporters, invitations to sit on talk shows and tell my side. They wanted me to write a book, to sign deals, to let the world peer inside my old wounds and turn them into entertainment. Some of my friends, even my neighbor Mrs. Bingham, urged me to seize the moment. "You could be famous, honey," she said, pressing my hand across her kitchen table. "People want to hear your story. They want to hear how you forgave your son, or how you brought him low. You deserve a little glory after all you've been through." I thanked her, but in my heart I knew better. Fame never held much shine for me. My happiness was never found in bright lights or magazine covers, but in the hush of a good evening, the sound of soup bubbling on the stove, the quiet laughter of a child at the kitchen table. And forgiveness, darling, it's never a grand announcement. It's 1,000 tiny choices made in silence. I forgave my boy a little bit every day. Each time I remembered his small hands in mine, or the way he'd tuck his face into my shoulder when he was scared. I forgave because bitterness grows heavy, and I was already tired enough. So when the phone rang or the letters arrived, I answered kindly but simply, "Thank you for your interest, but I have no wish to be a spectacle. I only wanted the truth to be known." I didn't sign anything. I didn't sell my sorrow. I kept my peace. Some didn't understand. They said I was wasting an opportunity, that I could use the world's attention for good, or at least for comfort. But I knew that no interview, no applause would bring back the years I lost with my son, or make the love we once shared any more real than it already was. I didn't seek revenge and I didn't crave fame. I wanted more than anything to go on living quietly, honestly, the way I always had. To find rest in my own home, among the small things that never lied to me. The ticking of the old clock, the warmth of sun on the porch, the peace that comes from telling the truth and letting it stand. Forgiveness was my victory, darling. Not the kind the world sees, but the kind that lets a mother sleep easy at night, knowing she never let the world turn her heart to stone. Life settled as it always does, like dust after a storm. The phone calls stopped, the letters slowed, and my name slipped back into the gentle silence of ordinary days. Some might think I missed the attention, but oh darling, I was grateful for the calm. I went back to my little house, my tomatoes and my garden, the old armchair by the window where the afternoon sun warmed my knees. The world had moved on. My son's name was less often in the news, and when it was just another story among so many. No longer a headline, no longer a tale of triumph built on my bones. I didn't see my son again, not right away. Sometimes I wondered if he'd ever come to my door. No cameras, no script, just the boy I once knew needing a soft place to land. But whether he did or not, my peace was not tied to his choices anymore. Instead, I found my comfort in the simple rituals that had always given me strength. I baked my banana bread, sent a loaf to Mrs. Bingham next door. I swept my porch, watered my violets, stitched the hem of an old dress. I wrote letters, Not for the papers but for myself, bits of memory and hope pressed between the lines. The truth had been told, and that was enough. Victory, as the world measures it, was never mine. I had no trophy, no check, no standing ovation. But I had my dignity, I had my quiet days, and I had the honest story of a mother's love. One the world could neither erase nor replace. Some days were still lonely. I'd sit with my tea in the fading light and think of the boy who once called me Mama, with his whole heart. I forgave him each time the memory stung. Let the ache pass through and out again. I loved him even when loving hurt. That, I think, is a mother's greatest strength. To keep loving quietly and without applause, even after all the world's noise has faded. I didn't choose fame. I didn't choose vengeance. I chose peace. And in that peace I found a kind of victory that no crowd could give or take away. So that's where I leave my story, dear. On a quiet porch with the scent of violets and the soft hum of a life well lived. The truth in the end was enough. I carried it in my heart, gentle and sure, and let it guide me home. And if one day my son should ever find his way back to my door, I'll be here. The kettle will be on, the porch light burning, and love, yes, love will be waiting.